Hi everyone, welcome to my second video on Blender. Today we're going to customize Blender some more, and before we start adding some new stuff, I would like to go back to the first video and set a few things straight, and I've also made some additional changes that I wanted to show you. First of all, I wanted to talk about the bool tools once again. If I open the N panel, right now we don't have the edit tab here because we don't have any objects in the scene. I'm just going to add a cube. Now we get all of these additional tabs, and if you hover your mouse over these, you can use the middle mouse wheel to scroll between them. Last time I told you that when you use the bool tools on the N panel, you can only do destructive Boolean operations, but that was wrong. For some reason I never took a look at the bottom section here. This is the section where you can do non-destructive Boolean operations. So just to demonstrate this, I'm going to duplicate this cube. If I select both of them and use the difference in the auto boolean section, you can see that the modifier gets applied. We don't have a boolean modifier here. If I undo that and use the difference boolean from the brush boolean section here, you can see we now have a non-destructive boolean operation. If you click on this icon here on the right, Blender will jump to the modifier properties in the properties panel and open the settings for this modifier here. And when you use the brush boolean operations, you also get a couple of other things that you can do here. For example, you can hide the bool objects or unhide them. You can apply all the modifiers or remove all the modifiers, so that's actually pretty nice. And I'm just going to undo that, go back to my two cubes here and hit the N key to hide the panel on the right side. There's a couple of things I also wanted to mention in the preferences here. On the interface tab, I didn't mention last time that I switched off the navigation controls. And by the way, just like last time, don't do the changes that I do, just have a look at those, make some notes if you want to, and in the preferences make sure to switch off autosave preferences, because otherwise every change that you make will automatically be saved, which may not be what you want. I'm going to keep this at the default, or at my default autosave preferences here. So anyway, in the last video I didn't mention that I switched off the navigation controls. If I switch these on, you can see these four icons over here. These are the navigation controls, and you can use these to zoom in and out, pan, and switch to camera view. I can't do that because I don't have a camera in my view right now. And there's also a button to switch between perspective and orthographic projection. I don't ever use that though. So I don't have a lot of use for these navigation controls. They just clutter up my viewport, so I switched those off. Under themes, I made some changes in the outliner, and all I did here was change the color of the active highlight and selected highlight. If I select this green icon here, you can see this is highlighted in black now, and the cube above it is highlighted in this light gray color. And I changed that because the default blue was a bit hard on the eyes, I think. Under viewport, there is also something that I wanted to mention. Now, last time I told you that I switched the interactive navigation to the simple axis, and I still have that switched on. The reason I use that is because, unlike in Cinema 4D, we don't get an indication of the positive axis direction in the viewport itself. Cinema 4D also has these colored lines that represent the axes, but Cinema 4D also has an arrow that points in the positive direction, and in Blender you don't have that. If you rotate this around, you won't see a difference if you just look at the cubes here in the scene, but if you take a look at the simple axis, you can see that we're upside down, and you can also see in, which direction is the positive direction. Each of these colored lines represents one of the axes, and each of these lines are pointing in the positive direction. So I know that this is the positive X direction, and this is the positive Y direction, for example. And the Z-axis by default is not switched on in Blender. You can do that under the viewport overlays. I don't use it though. So what else? Under the add-ons, I forgot to mention that there also is an extra curve objects add-on. So last time we added the extra mesh objects. There also are additional curve objects. I've also switched that on. Under navigation, I turned the depth back on. Now last time I told you that if you move your objects over here, for example, and your mouse over to the right and you start rotating, it's going to rotate the entire scene out of view. And that is a bit weird, but honestly, you know, if you have your objects in your scene, you will probably click and rotate or pan somewhere where the objects are. And the reason I switched the depth back on is because in edit mode I found that when I'm modeling, it actually is more accurate to use the depth option. Just give it a try and see which one works better for you, depth or no depth, or maybe you even prefer the orbit around selection option here. So I just thought I'd mention that I switched that back on because it's just better. On the key map, I forgot to mention the preferences right at the top. You've probably seen this in a number of other videos already, but I just thought I'd mention it. By default, Blender now is set to the left mouse button for selecting objects, which is what most people do, so that's fine. But the spacebar action by default is set to play, which is quite annoying. I've changed that to tools, and I guess most people do that too. And if you do that, you can, for example, remember only one shortcut and get access to a lot of tools. So if you hold down spacebar now with this option set to tools, you get this menu here. And this corresponds to the T panel on the left here. So everything you have on the T panel you can access by holding down the spacebar and then clicking on one of the options here or using the shortcut that is indicated on the right. And I use that a lot for switching between the move gizmo, for example, the rotate gizmo, and the scale gizmo. I do like to use the gizmos in Blender, or I can use the spacebar to go back to the select box, which is the default in Blender here. And I still have the object gizmo here. That's because I've changed another setting that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But while we're at it, we might as well talk about some shortcuts and some stuff that I found out. One is the shortcut for framing objects. And the Blender shortcut for that is numpad period key. And this doesn't work for me. And the reason is because I'm on a German keyboard and German numbers are, for example, 10,5 and not 10.5. That's why I don't have a period key on the numpad, but a comma key. This is one of the shortcuts that you can change in Blender without doing any harm. So if you go to your key map in the preferences and make sure that name is selected, and if you type in frame selected, the one that this is about is the second one under 3D view, and you can just click on that and type in the numpad comma if you're on a German keyboard, and then framing will work. So now if I hit the numpad comma or period in English, the object will be framed. And you can hit the home key, which is position 1 on German keyboards, to frame the entire scene. And position 1 doesn't require any changes. This is working no matter if you're on a German keyboard or another keyboard. The shortcut for framing objects can also be used for something else. If I select these cubes here, and I'll just duplicate them a couple of times. So let's move these up and hit the home key to frame all of these cubes, and I'm going to duplicate all of these and move them over to here. And then I'm going to select these and go to Objects, Collection, and Move to Collection. The shortcut for that is M, and when you click on that, you will get this window here. And I'll add a new collection and rename it to 01 cubes. And I'm going to put these ones in a collection as well. So M and new collection, and I'll call this 2 more cubes. So now we have these two collections in, oh, did I put them in there? No, I didn't. So let's just do that again. More cubes. Okay, there we go. So now we have these two collections here. And if I select one of these cubes here, for example, I can go to the outliner and hit the shortcut for framing objects, which is comma for me, or period key probably for you. And if I do that, Blender will open the collection and jump to the object that I have selected here. And that's similar to what in Cinema 4D is called scroll to first active. So in Cinema 4D, you can go to the object manager and there's a view tab. And if you open that, you have an option that says scroll to first active. And I do use that occasionally, so I thought that might be useful for you too. The reason why I named these collections is because I saw a couple of videos about Blender and people were using shortcuts to hide collections. And they were using the shift key and a number. And nobody explained how that works, but it seems to be like this. Blender looks at these collections from top to bottom, and it seems to give each of these a number starting with 1. So depending on which number in the order of collections a collection is, that is the number you want to use in connection with the shift key to hide the collection. So in this case, if I wanted to hide collection number 2, the shortcut would be Shift and 2, and Shift 2 to unhide it. And if I want to hide the first one, Shift 1, and Shift 1 again to unhide it. Next, I want to talk about a couple of shortcuts related to cameras. Right now I don't have a camera in my scene, so I'm going to add one here. And I'm going to duplicate that and move the copy maybe over to here. Now, in order to switch to the camera view, or rather to move the camera to your viewport position, there is a shortcut in Blender and I absolutely hate it. And the shortcut is Ctrl Alt and 0 on the numpad. So with this camera selected, I'm going to hit that shortcut, Ctrl Alt 0 on the numpad. But look what happens. The camera is still where I put it a minute ago, and the camera we actually moved to the view position was the first one that we added to the scene. And it looks like I accidentally put these in this first collection. I'm just going to drag them out of there if I can. And just move this down a little bit and then drag these out of this collection here. So right now we're viewing the scene from camera number 1, although the second one was selected. And the reason for that is, or seems to be, that I didn't have the reason seems to be that the first camera we added automatically was the active camera. And it seems that in Blender you need to click on this green camera icon to actually make the camera the active camera. And when you're in a camera view, clicking on these green camera icons will switch to the other camera. So if I click on the icon for the second camera, we're going into that second camera here. In order to get out of the camera view, you need to hit 0 on the numpad. So if I want to move the second camera to my view position, I'm just going to rotate around a bit. Selecting the camera won't be enough. I also need to select this green camera icon, it seems, and then I can hit that shortcut, Ctrl Alt 0 on the numpad, and now I have moved that camera to my view position. And by clicking on the camera icons here, I can switch between those two cameras, and 0 to switch out of the camera view. And there's a reason why I'm mentioning all of these shortcuts, and I'll explain that a little bit later. So first of all, I'm going to deselect everything here by just left clicking anywhere in the viewport. And there's a couple more shortcuts I want to talk about, and you can find them under View and Viewpoint. In the last video I told you that I'm using a couple of custom shortcuts that I wouldn't recommend in order to switch between the top, front and right views, for example. And for the right view I have F3, which in Blender by default is the shortcut for the menu search. I have remapped that to F8. I'm not sure what harm I might have done by changing that shortcut, but like I said, I don't recommend that you do the same thing. I do want a shortcut for the menu search though, because this is like the commander in Cinema 4D and it's extremely useful. In any case, my point is that I don't like the numpad shortcuts and I don't like to use them. And in Blender there are add-ons for certain things, like the spacebar that I showed you earlier. So spacebar, if you remember, brings up this menu here. And by the way, if you switch to edit mode, I'll just go back to my select box here, object mode. Oh, I need to have an object selected in order to be able to switch to edit mode. Now, if I switch to edit mode, you get all of these additional icons here for all of the, or for some of the modeling tools in Blender. And if I hit spacebar, I get all of these options as well. So if you don't want to use the shortcuts, you can use the spacebar in edit mode too, and you can even access the sub-level menus here and pick the tool that you want. Let's go back to object mode by hitting the tab key. So what I'm trying to say with this is that the spacebar, for example, gives you access to a lot of other tools, and the only shortcut you need to remember is spacebar. And for other things in Blender, there's similar things you can do. So let's go to edit preferences, and if you go to add-ons and look for pie, you will find the interface 3D viewport pie menus. If you activate that and unfold it, you will see a lot of pie menus here. By default, all of these are switched on. I switched all of these off. If you want to, feel free to explore what these do. The only one I kept switched on was the last one, the view numpad pie, and the hotkey for that is Alt Q. And that is one of the examples for things in Blender where you only need to remember one shortcut to be able to access a lot of tools. So if I hit Alt Q, I get a total of, I think, 16 options. Now, one of them is the option to switch between all of the orthographic views, which is really cool. I hardly ever use the back view or bottom view, but sometimes I do, and I don't want to use the numpad shortcuts in Blender for that. And that's why I've activated this add-on here. And the nice thing about this is if you want to work quickly, so you can either hit Alt Q and then pick the left view, for example, or you could also swipe. So what that means is if I open this menu again with Alt Q, you can see that the top view is located at the top, bottom at the bottom, left. The left orthographic view is on the left hand side and the right orthographic view is on the right hand side. Now what that means is I can also swipe, so Alt Q, swipe left, I will switch to the left orthographic view. Alt Q, swipe right, I'll switch to the right orthographic view, and I can do the same thing with top and bottom, for example. So that's really nice. And here you can see that the simple axis is really useful because I can see that I am upside down here in my scene, so I'm just going to rotate that around again. So that's very nice. That's one of the best things I've discovered so far in Blender. You just need to be careful. If you don't select anything, just left click here at the center to exit the menu, or you can hit escape, or you can right click. But if you move your mouse anywhere, you can see one of the options always gets highlighted. So if I left click, I will move to the front view here, which is not what I want. That's something I still need to get used to. So I try to use escape for everything because that makes the most sense to me. Let's have a look at some of the other options here. We also have camera options. Well, let's start with the framing options first. We also have options to frame objects here. So let's pick one of these cubes here, Alt Q, and frame selected. So it's going to frame that cube here. And if I hit Alt Q again, I can frame all and it will frame the entire scene. And then there's another option that says, let's start with this one, perspective orthographic. This is just for switching between perspective and orthographic projection. So the same thing you get on with the navigation controls if you have those activated. But like I said, I don't use that a lot, but it's there if you want it. So this can also be accessed in the Alt-Q pie menu here. And then there's an option that says local and global, and that is a bit confusing because local and global for me is what I have up here, the global coordinate system and the local coordinate system, which correspond to the world coordinate system and the object coordinate system in Cinema 4D. Now we don't really have a shortcut for that in Blender to switch between those two. And like with so many other things, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you assign shortcuts to them. You can do that if you right click on one of these options here. You can assign a shortcut, but you know, I'd rather not because you don't know what other things will be changed in Blender. So I guess you know that global and local is the difference between moving in the world coordinate system and moving in the object coordinate system. If I rotate this object around a bit, let's do something like this, and then switch back to the select box. If I use the object gizmo here, or I could also use the Blender shortcut G and Y, for example, to constrain it to constrain movement to the Y-axis, you can see the object, although we've rotated it, is moving along the global Y-axis. If I hit Y again, well, in this case doesn't do anything. Let's try X. So if I hit X twice, it's going to move along the local X-axis. If I hit X again, it's going to move along the global X-axis here. Just hit escape here. And the same goes if you move the object with the gizmo, if you prefer the gizmos, and personally I do. I use a mixture between gizmos and the Blender shortcuts for moving, rotating, and scaling objects. But I do feel more comfortable using the gizmo because I guess that's what many people are used to from other software like Max Maya and Cinema 4D. So, but if you use the gizmo, you need to switch to local. And it's a bit of a pain always having to go up there and switching between local and global. There is a pie menu that you can use to switch between global and local. And I think it's the comma key on the keyboard. You can see we get some options here. The only ones I'm using are the global option and the local option. And like with the Alt-Q pie menu, you can hit comma and swipe. So I just swiped to the right and now I'm in local mode, and if I swipe the other way I can switch back to global mode without having to go up there. But what I actually wanted to show you was the Alt-Q menu. We also have a local and global option here, but this has nothing to do with this one up here. What this option here does in the Alt-Q pie menu is it frames the object and hides everything else. And if you hit Alt-Q and local global again, it's going to frame the scene and unhide the other objects again. So very nice. The Alt-Q menu is actually really good. You also have the option to toggle the quad view. I don't really use that. I don't work with quad views in Cinema 4D either. And the other, or the last option here on the right, is to toggle full, which is a bit confusing. So what you can do with this is toggle to a maximized view. And if you hit Alt-Q, toggle full again, you go back to the default viewport here. The shortcut you can use in Blender for this is Control Spacebar. So Control Spacebar to toggle maximized view and Control Spacebar to go back. You can also find that under View, Area, Toggle Maximize Area. But if you want to, like I said, you can also use the Alt-Q pie menu to toggle between this maximized view. And it's a bit confusing because the name is different than it is in this menu here. Here it's called Toggle Maximized Area. So let's have a look at the left side. And in order to demonstrate these options here, we actually need a camera. We do have one, but you know what, I'll just delete these two cameras and Shift A, and I'm going to add a new one here. So this right now is our active camera, and for some reason I have again put it in the first collection. which I didn't want to do. So what I can do with the Alt Q menu here is move the camera to the view position. So if I do that, the camera will be moved to my view position. And I can also use this menu to exit the camera or to enter the active camera. So if you have more cameras, just remember to click on the green icon of the camera you want to move to first before you use this option, because otherwise it's going to move you to a totally different camera. You also have the option in here to lock the camera to the view position, which is very useful. So what this does is, once you've activated the lock, you can frame your scene without moving the camera. And usually you would need to do that by going to the N panel, go to View, and go to View up here, View Lock, and lock camera to view. So you can switch that on and off here. Or you can do this a little bit faster with the Alt Q menu. I'm not sure what lock transforms does. The border option here is like, you get these, can you see that? These little white corners here, and you can click and drag on them. You can also, can you move this around? No, apparently not, but you can frame a certain area. This is like, what's it called in Cinema 4D? Render region, I think. Render region. So you need to be in a camera to be able to define a render region or a border. And this border is the area that will be rendered if you hit the render button in Blender, which is F12. And Alt Q, click on this again to switch off the border. And also let's exit the camera. So this is a very useful menu, and I've set this as a default, so it's available every time I open Blender. And there's one more thing I wanted to mention about cameras. Let's go back to Edit and Preferences, and on the Add-ons tab, let's just move up here. And now I'm going to search for stored, and what you will find is 3D view stored views. If you activate that, if I unfold that, you can see the location is View 3D sidebar View Stored Views, and there's no shortcut for that, and it seems you can't define any keyboard shortcuts or other stuff. So let's just go out of the preferences or exit the preferences here, and we can find this add-on like the preferences say under View 3D, the sidebar, the N panel over here, it is under stored views. Now by default this is at the bottom of the list. You can left click and drag on these little dotted rectangles here to move stuff around. However, Blender will only remember the position of this add-on for as long as you have Blender open, unless you save a default startup scene, which you're going to do a little bit later. Anyway, if you click on this little arrow here to unfold the stored views, you don't see anything yet. You have to initialize the stored views. And now you get a couple of options. And here's a couple of nice things you can do with this. So for example, I can rotate around my scene, and if I like a certain view, I can store that by using the Save Current button here. So let's store a couple of views here, and maybe one more. And this is not a camera, this is just a view that is saved by Blender. And now I can left click on any of these stored views here to switch to the respective view, which is really nice. And if I like a particular view and I would like to render from this view, I can also create a camera. And for this I can use the new camera. Let me just drag this over a little bit. New camera to view. So if you like this view and you would like to render it, you need a camera, and you can use this button and Blender will create a camera at this view position. Below the Save Current section is a camera selector, and this section shows all of the cameras in your scene. And once you're inside any of the cameras in your scene, you can use the stored views also to switch between the cameras. There is no option though to exit a camera. So in this case, let's use the Alt Q menu and exit the camera view. And when I'm not in a camera, like I said, I can click on these, but nothing is going to happen because I'm not in a camera view. So what I would have to do is just view cam to enter a camera, and then I can switch between these. So this is very nice and also very useful. You also have an option if you add a camera to your scene. Let's see if this works. Camera to view. And of course it doesn't. Why? Because this camera was not the active camera. Just going to exit out of here and move my viewport around a little bit. So let's make sure that we actually select the camera. I think it's this one. And then we can use this button here to move that camera to the view position. But this is also something we can do with the Alt Q menu, like I showed you earlier. So I just saw that this video has been going on for 30 or 40 minutes. Let's take a break now, and we'll talk about creating a custom default startup scene in the next video. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you again soon.